Well, ladies and gentlemen, how unlikely it is, how improbable that such a otherwise dry and technical subject as beneficial ownership would have over the last month been at the centre of a political and media firestorm. As tempting it is to follow the last headline and see breathlessly what the latest update is, I think in looking at the question of the Panama Papers, but also beneficial ownership more broadly, some historical context is a good thing. I think over the last decade, or really 2 decades, we've seen this rise in this belief and availability of big data, of more information being better. And as I'll talk about in connection with beneficial ownership, this is nowhere more expressed than in the idea of centralised registries of beneficial ownership. And that this faith in more information, whether we're talking about more financial information exchange for anti-money laundering purposes, the CRS for tax, or beneficial ownership, has really been so far immune to the disappointments in terms of the policy payoffs. So even though we've had these exponential rises in the availability and exchange of data, even though the policy gains are so far not particularly apparent, the solution for this problem is seen as being yet more data. And there's been something of a displacement effect whereby more information, more data, rather than being seen as a means to an end, whether it's fighting money laundering, fighting tax evasion, improving prudential regulation, has come to be instead an end in itself. Furthermore, we've seen not only the increase in data and information, but really the inability of both public and private institutions to keep it secret or keep it private. So on the public side, we've of course got WikiLeaks and the leaks by Edward Snowden for the National Security Agency. And then of course we've got the private data leaks that Jeff's referred to, and most recently the Panama Papers. Okay, in terms of the report that Jeff referenced downstairs on the beneficial ownership conundrum, I think it's important to say as well that the link between this increase in big data and the focus on beneficial ownership is by no means a technical project, but instead is a political one. Transparency now is seen as not only a buzzword, but a trump card in any policy argument. If you can put yourself on the right side of the transparency agenda, it's really a one-word trump card that, as I say, overcomes other objections. And this has been driven to a surprising degree by a variety of non-governmental organisations that have got particularly close ties with the British government at the moment. Okay, so the report downstairs, the beneficial ownership conundrum, as Jeff has referenced, really combines and then updates research from 2 co-authored books. The first one's called Puppet Masters. It's a joint production with 4 other authors, by the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which is in itself a joint enterprise of the World Bank, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, looking at grand corruption and kleptocracy, and particularly the use of corporate vehicles in laundering those funds. The second one is Global Shell Games, which again, as Jeff has mentioned, is based on mystery shopping and co-authored with Mike Findley and Dan Nielson. The conclusions of the report can be summarised pretty succinctly. And this is it takes aim at the current fixation by the British government, by a group of NGOs and also the European Union, that whatever beneficial ownership you have, that the idea, beneficial ownership problem you have, that centralised registries are not only the best answer, but in fact the only one. And the gist of the report is to say that this presumption is not only wrong on both counts, but actually dangerous. Taking it as a question of law first, I think in talking about beneficial ownership, about corporate transparency, about what works and what doesn't, there's a considerable need for modesty and humility. The evidence that we have so far is patchy, it's incomplete. So therefore it seems very incongruous, the degree of zealotry about the idea that centralised registries are beneficial ownership, whereas if they're public in the United Kingdom or private in most of the rest of the European Union, are somehow going to be the answer. I think we can contest this idea of beneficial ownership registries being the only or the best answer in 2 senses. The first legal and the second practical, or in terms of effectiveness. I think you only need to be briefly acquainted with the relevant standards from the Financial Action Task Force, the G8 or the G20, to find out that there's sort of an enlightened pluralism or agnosticism. The standards say countries must be able to look through corporate vehicles, whether it's companies or others, to find the beneficial owner. It's not a particularly new standard. It's been in place for the FATF since 2003. But ever since that time, the FATF and the other groups have said there are a variety of alternatives by which you can get to that outcome. There are many roads to the same destination. And so this fixation on central registries of beneficial ownership is really completely at odds with the idea that different countries can try different alternatives. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. So to the extent that David Cameron or NGOs like Transparency International or Global Witness say that international standards mandate that all countries, that the Crown dependencies and overseas territories have such a centralised registry, this is really just plain wrong. But I think really the more interesting question is what works. As a social scientist, I'm less interested in laws and regulations on the books than the actual results that we get, the policy outcomes. Are we catching criminals? Are we deterring or detecting tax evasion? Are, in fact, corporate vehicles transparent in the way that we hope? And certainly it's been a very positive development on the international stage that the FATF, the OECD and other groups have moved away from a rather kind of sterile look at effectiveness by just reading rules on the books in order to find out, to assess things through things like the mutual valuation report process, to go through and get some idea of effectiveness there. Okay, given that we've got this positive focus and this question, how do we know if beneficial ownership registries will be effective? In terms of effectiveness, are they the only or the best route? And again, I think although the conclusions do have to be tentative, there are considerable grounds for scepticism. First off, referring to the puppet masters, part of this process was a whole series of data gathering exercises. So we went and interviewed people in registries, we interviewed people in law enforcement, we interviewed people in the industry as well. We did a bit of a mystery shopping exercise, and we compiled a database of grand corruption or kleptocracy cases. One of the things that struck us in interviewing people in registries is that they had very little desire to be sort of lumbered with this extra responsibility of establishing beneficial ownership. People in registries rightly see their role in a fairly passive or archival way. Registries receive information, but they have little desire or capacity to verify it. So really making them, in some sense, the guardian of this valuable beneficial ownership information runs up against the fact that they neither have nor want a verification function. Furthermore, there are grounds for disquiet because it seems like for many registries are having a very tough time keeping up with their existing responsibilities, let alone this idea of imposing this much more demanding requirement upon them. So even within the European Union, there are some cautionary tales. In one case, in 2011, a group of Norwegian investigative journalists went to the Cypriot registry in pursuit of legal ownership information and annual accounts for 30 companies, Cypriot companies, but owned by Norwegians. First off, despite the legal requirement that this information should be public, this legal ownership and accounts, they found it very hard to get into the registry. But once they managed to talk their way through the reluctant Cypriot staff, they found an incredible spectacle of heaps and mounds of unopened correspondence. And they found to their horror that none of the letters over the last 11 years had actually been opened by people working in the Cypriot registry. So in fact, in arriving in 2011, the most up-to-date information there was 2000. So really no one in the registry had any idea about who had been submitting, if they had been submitting, and what they had been submitting in the interim. Okay. Now, Cyprus may be an extreme case, but there's, as I say, grounds for disquiet that other registries are having the same sort of problem. Okay, so if there's some grounds to be sceptical about the performance of centralised registries, the question is, well, how do we know the alternatives do any better? What else can we do? The leading alternative is having licensed and regulated corporate service providers. And I realise this is going to be a very familiar concept to the people in this room, given that Jersey and other IFCs have had this system in place for a long time. I put it forward as an alternative here, but of course these options are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some jurisdictions like Jersey do have both. Given that we have maybe 10 years' experience of licensed and regulated corporate service providers, what faith, what confidence can we have that this will produce the sort of beneficial ownership performance that we want? And here I turn to the second sort of project, Global Shell Games. Again, as has been indicated, that's based on this massive sort of mystery shopping exercise where we impersonated a range of 21 high and low risk clients, from fairly innocuous, innocent-looking people from the Scandinavian countries, my own country of Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And then, on the contrary, a group of ridiculously, obviously high-risk clients, people in the procurement ministries of extremely corruption-prone West African or Central Asian countries, people who should have raised every terrorism finance red flag in the book, fictitious personas who said they worked for Muslim charities in Saudi Arabia, that they were comprised of Yemeni and Pakistani nationals, okay? Countries that are rightly or wrongly perceived as having a high degree of corruption risk. We designed a common template letter and sent it out we made 7,500 solicitations to corporate service providers in pretty much every country in the world, asking fairly simply that we were interested in purchasing a shell company, but we wanted to know what identity documents, if any, were required. The results were disturbing and a bit depressing on 3 levels. First off, we found that the global performance was pretty mediocre, despite the fact that, as I say, these beneficial ownership standards are nothing particularly new. They'd been more than 10 years old at the time we did the exercise. About half of the replies that we got did not ask for sufficient identity documents to prove the true identity of the client and thereby establish the beneficial owner. And a quarter of the replies that we got didn't ask for any identity documents at all. There were no questions asked of these hundreds of providers who were happy just to sell a shell company without doing any know your customer work or any customer due diligence. The second one, we found interesting patterns of risk sensitivity, but also disturbing patterns of lack of sensitivity, of insensitivity. We found that in the response rate to our emails and the willingness to do business with us, it didn't really matter if you were the very low corruption risk person from Denmark or the ridiculously obvious corruption risk in government procurement from Equatorial Guinea or Kazakhstan, that corporate service providers were equally willing to do business and were no more likely to perform customer due diligence on the very high corruption risk clients as compared to the very low corruption risk ones. Lastly, and probably most relevant for the focused discussion of corporate service providers and beneficial owners, is that international financial centres actually did much better on average than OECD countries. And in fact, very surprisingly, poor developing countries actually applied the rules on beneficial ownership more stringently than the OECD countries on average. In fact, the United States, which you might expect to be a leader in this area, given that it had done so much to impose these rules on other countries, in fact was a laggard, was one of the worst performing jurisdictions there. And in fact, we had cases in the United States of providers who accurately identified our terrorism risk, but said, well, look, you look like a terrorism risk, so we're going to have to charge you more to do business with you. So very disquieting responses. But the positive, as much of this was depressing and a little bit disturbing, the positive was that jurisdictions like Jersey, like the Caymans, like other IFCs, that have had this licensing and regulation of corporate service providers for 10 or more years, actually did a very, very strong job. And particularly Jersey and the Caymans, we found out every single provider that we contacted said that refused to do any business unless we, the fictitious customer, identified ourselves and proved our identity by supplying the standard suite of identity documents. Okay, well, as I flagged at the beginning, it would be a bit remiss to make no mention of the Panama Papers in the month of April 2016 in talking about beneficial ownership. The Panama Papers have been presented as unprecedented. In a narrow sense, they are in terms of the size of the software. But we've been here before with similar leaks. In particular, the offshore leaks of April 2013 from Commonwealth Trust Services and Portcullisnet are pretty close analogues of what we've had so far. And indeed, the database of the Panama Papers that comes online in 10 days' time, I think, at least a little bit more, on May the 9th, will be exactly the same format as the database that's already online for that earlier leak in terms of how it can be searched and what information. Okay, Jeff has already mentioned that one of the things that's come out of it is this very unfortunate stigmatization whereby there's this equation of smallness and islandness with somehow engaged in dodgy dealings or shady business. I think this is particularly unfortunate when the best evidence we have is that, as I've already flagged, IFCs in fact lead the field when it comes to the stringency of actually applying beneficial ownership standards. Conversely, it takes the spotlight off where more pressure is needed, and that's jurisdictions like the UK, where corporate service providers are licensed in theory but not really inspected in practice, or even more so the United States. Here I think you can have a reasonable debate about the relative performance of licensed corporate service providers or centralised registries. But considering that the United States has neither of these options, I think it's unfortunately patently and painfully obvious that the United States is the real point of vulnerability when it comes to beneficial ownership and the availability of anonymous shell companies, exactly the sort that are so valuable to money launderers and those looking to evade tax. A couple of points to finish up. In some ways, it's surprising that we've got the biggest reaction from the Panama Papers from the countries where you've had the least criminality revealed, and the least reaction from the countries where you've had the strongest indications of criminality. So you've got things where, you've got this guilt by association or insinuation with individuals in, say, Britain or Australia or elsewhere in Western Europe, even though you haven't really got much evidence at all of tax evasion or corruption or money laundering and so on. Conversely, the large majority of Mossack Fonseca's clients coming from Russia and China, the whole thing has obviously been dismissed as a CIA conspiracy by the government of the Russian Federation, a theory that seems surprisingly widely accepted amongst the Russian populace. And then you've got this deafening silence in China where all of the news has been suppressed. So in some ways, surprisingly, just like the Panama Papers is not really a story about offshore, it's much more a story about onshore, and it's not even so much a story about the North Atlantic area as post-communist Europe and the areas that have risen recently, the BRICS and so on. The final point, and just circling back to tax compliance, it often gets lost in this debate about more information, more stringent sanctions and so on, that it seems the best thing that motivates people to pay their taxes is the feeling that they actually get value for money out of their government. And if you're actually looking to understand and improve tax compliance, it's not so much getting reams and reams, terabytes, petabytes of data. It's not so much locking people up and finding things. It is instilling confidence in the population that the government is actually governing with their best interests at heart. Thank you very much.